So this week we're going to be talking about the criminal justice system, and it's going to be rather a brief overview of a very complex system because we have the whole federal system and then each state has its own system. So this is going to be just a primer, an overview of that system. As soon as I advance the slide. The criminal justice system, you can think about it on three different levels, or it can be analyzed on three different levels. And that is the macro level, which talks about the structure of the court system, the federal court system, the civil court system, the criminal court system, all the judges, how they get appointed, and all of that. So there's the structural end of the criminal justice system. There's the legal part, which is what laws people have broken, how laws get written and enforced and interpreted by the courts. And then there's the policy in terms of mandatory minimums. Some of those are written into law, some of them are state policy. So that's the macro level of the criminal justice system. The meso level of the criminal justice system has to do with families and groups that people belong to, organizations that people belong to, and communities. So this is really the peer groups, family groups, those kinds of influences that can impact criminology or the behavior of people who commit crimes. And then there's the micro level, which is really about individual behavior. So individual choices, individual agency, whether an individual chooses to break the law or not. And so there's a lot of psychology and sociology that looks at the micro level, like why does this person do these things that are socially deviant. So there are three levels that you can really analyze the criminal justice system on. What's interesting to me is that most analyses of the criminal justice system have to do with the macro level and the micro level, but we don't spend a lot of time analyzing what goes on in the community that either tamps down crime or ratchets up crime or criminal behavior. So I think it's an important thing to think about, especially when we're talking about social services, why we focus on the individual and maybe the legal, but we don't focus as much on community responses and services to sidestep criminal behavior. So here's a key point in terms of legislation and the law. Until an action is defined by a law to be criminal, it's not a crime. So it's interesting, particularly when you look at abortion, for example, and that has gone back and forth. Is it a crime? Is it not a crime? State to state, that may vary. So until the law is changed, a particular behavior may not be criminal. And then once the law is passed, a certain behavior may be a crime. So what's the criminal justice process? And this is, again, a very brief overview. But certainly it starts with the law. A bill is proposed for a new law or to amend existing law to make a certain thing a crime. Decriminalization of a behavior can happen, though it's rare. For example, marijuana possession. So federally, marijuana is still against the law and it's a criminal behavior, but some states have decriminalized it. And marijuana really is the exception because decriminalization of certain acts or behaviors is pretty rare. So once the law is proposed and it makes it through the House and the Senate, it's signed into law or vetoed, and eventually it is signed. So whatever behavior this new law covers, now it becomes a crime. So once the law is enacted, the law enforcement apparatus, mostly police officers, they're the front line, they can arrest individuals who violate this law. Once somebody's arrested, they have a right to a defense attorney, and that is usually private counsels hired with your own private money, or a public defender who is assigned to you. Then the person may be booked into jail, bailed out if bail is set at a price that they can afford, or they could go to a bail bondsman where they have to put up some collateral like their house or something, depending on how much of a loan the bail bondsman gives the person to bail the person out. Or it could just be a notice to appear in court. So there's a range of things that can happen once a person is arrested. They don't always go directly to jail. At that point, there's what's known as prosecutorial discretion. So the district attorney or the assistant district attorney looks at the arrest and decides whether to charge a crime and at what level. So is it a felony? Is it a misdemeanor, right? And usually that has to do with the district attorney in the place where the crime occurred. So let's say I go commit a crime in Chicago, then the DA in Chicago decides what those charges are going to be, even though I live somewhere else. So it's up to that particular district attorney to decide how to charge that particular behavior or crime, or whether to charge it at all. So again, there's a range of charges from misdemeanor to felony, and that's what the DAs decide and the prosecutors decide. What can they make a case around? So if there is some kind of criminal indictment, the case will proceed to trial, where the court will ensure that the person gets due process. Because of the 14th Amendment, we can't take someone's rights away without some kind of due process. And depending on the nature of the crime, how high the bail was set, the person may remain in jail until their trial. And once the trial happens, again, this is a gross oversimplification, the person's either acquitted or sentenced. And they might be sentenced to probation. If they have been in jail for a while, awaiting their trial, they may be just sentenced to their time served. Because some people wait a long time to get to trial because the courts are so, in some areas, it is so busy and so backed up on cases. And the third kind of sentence is you get a prison sentence into some kind of correctional system placement. So once a person serves their time, that they can get paroled early. So they may not have to serve their complete sentence if they have good behavior, or if it's a nonviolent crime, et cetera, et cetera. They may go up for parole, and the parole board at each institution decides whether the person gets parole or not. And parole involves being monitored and all that, and once you're in the community. So you could be paroled early, or you could be released upon completion of your sentence. So that's sort of the process. And like I said, it's a pretty simplified version of the process. There's an awful lot that goes into all of this. And then many jails or prisons have programs that transition the person into the community. Many do not. Some give somebody, their valuables back and give them Uber ride to somewhere, and that's it. So it really varies one municipality to another what kinds of services happen post-release. So what's the community impact, right? So once a behavior is defined as a criminal behavior, then the community, right, we're talking about the meso level here, can recognize that and react to it. And I don't think this will come as a big surprise, but there's a big difference between the law that's on the books and how it gets implemented or how that law is applied on the streets. So reaction to law breaking varies. Then the community plays a significant role. So in some areas, people, walk right by and say, what I don't know doesn't hurt me. And in other areas, as soon as something suspicious is going on, somebody's on the horn calling the police, right? So communities play a significant role in how criminal behavior is tolerated or not, and the degree to which it's tolerated. Often part of this process is that somebody has to report that a crime is going on, or a victim needs to report that a crime has happened, and that doesn't always happen. People don't want to press charges for any number of reasons, or don't want to cause trouble, so they just let it go. So in areas where there's a lot of chaos and a lot of social disorganization, those areas tend to have higher rates of crime and lower rates of social norms and control. The other thing that the community can determine is how likely are people to get involved or to not get involved in the whole bystander phenomenon. Do I get involved or do I not? So communities play a pretty significant part in how the law is applied, reporting of crimes, etc. So in terms of the system, police are obviously the initial gatekeepers. Once a crime is reported, the police then respond, and they are the initial deciders about what is happening in a particular situation. The victims in some cases can decide whether to press charges or not, although that has changed, and it really depends on the offense. Like if somebody is speeding and crashes into someone's car, someone may or may not decide to press charges against that person. Then, once the charges are applied, right, the prosecutors then decide whether the case goes to trial or not. So they decide, is there sufficient evidence to charge this crime or take the case to court? And sometimes there isn't enough evidence, so there won't be charges and the person won't be brought to trial. So once again, prosecutorial discretion. They can dismiss cases, they can file charges, they can negotiate plea deals with people who have committed crimes. And in general, the defense attorneys advocate for their clients, and obviously, like any other profession, some defense attorneys are really great and other defense attorneys are not so much. But in general, their job is to advocate for the person, advocate for plea deals that make sense, and offer counsel to the person about what should happen. Once the case is brought, then judges decide how the case proceeds, when it is going to happen, and all the logistics around a jury, whether it's a bench trial or a jury trial. So all of those things are within a particular court system's purview. So a judge will decide how that case proceeds. And so the point here is that the process of becoming a convicted criminal involves lots of different steps and lots of different people who are making judgments all along the way. Ideally, the courts are neutral parties in this process. So they take the evidence and they make sure that everybody's heard and that due process is protected. However, because it's people within the court system, those same people bring their own biases and attitudes and prejudices to their work. And some of it's conscious and some of it may be unconscious. So law enforcement exercises their judgment when it comes to arrests. Then another factor in this is that courts are often overwhelmed. They have way more cases, and they need to ensure efficiency because we have laws about timely trials, right? That you can't be held in jail indefinitely. So there is this pressure on courts to make sure people move through the system in a timely way. Then judges, people, have discretion in sentencing. Although there are some crimes that have mandatory minimum sentences, so that those kinds of crimes really limit a judge's discretion about how much time you get. And once again, judges are people, and sometimes they may have racist tendencies. They may have their own prejudices and biases, and that may come into the sentencing process. So ideally, law enforcement, judges, courts, prosecutors are supposed to be neutral, but because they are people, they bring the same societal biases or not into the process. What's interesting is most offenders don't spend more than a couple of days in jail. They're out on bail, waiting trial. So, the idea that somebody goes to jail and stays there is not the norm. Most arrested persons serve their sentences in a county jail or as probation in the community. And what we see, and what I'm gonna put up some data for you to look at. It really indicates that law enforcement and the courts apply the laws and sentence people differentially according to race and status. So if you are a rich white person who can afford a great defense lawyer and commit a crime, the same crime may be committed by somebody who is poor black male, and the data show that probably the courts are going to treat those two individuals, even though they committed the same crime, they're going to treat those two individuals differently. Another variable in this is because of mental health and substance use disorder, or mental illness and substance use disorder, we have mental health courts and drug courts that help take some of the pressure off criminal courts for those defendants who are eligible to go through a mental health court or a drug court. And oftentimes they may serve some time, but they will also be mandated to treatment and counseling and the other supports they need to address whatever symptoms of mental illness and substance use disorder impacted the crime. But these mental health courts and drug courts are not universally available, and they really vary state to state in how many they are and the access that people have to them. So another assumption in this is that people are free to choose, or free to choose their own behavior, or they have agency. However, some of us know that often behavior occurs within a community context, within a family context. And so behavior often occurs in the context that can constrain it or not. So what if, for example, you don't know there are choices, that everyone around you is engaging in selling drugs, for example, and you can't see another way to make money. So you may have limited life experience and you don't know there are other choices for you. Another contextual issue that may impact an individual's ability to be free to choose are cognitive deficits or mental illness or substance use disorder. So maybe I'm stealing things just to feed my substance use disorder. And so would I be stealing things if I didn't have an addiction to feed? That's another question. It's another variable that makes addiction makes people less free to choose their behavior, in my opinion. There are some environments where if you don't do this, right, if you don't sell this, then, we're going to beat you up, for example. So people may engage initially in criminal behavior because of coercion and fear, right? If I don't join this gang, then I'm going to be suspect. They're going to think I'm a narc, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of situations where people, if they don't have as much free choice as we think they do in terms of engaging in criminal behavior. And then there's poverty. When you got a family to feed and you can't figure out how to make ends meet, then maybe you write that fraudulent check. Maybe you engage in that behavior. So these are all things to consider that I think in some ways mitigate an individual's freedom to choose to engage in criminal behavior or not. And there are others, obviously. So a key point in this is the social or the context in which you live. So informal social control provided by family, peers, and the community is more effective in maintaining socially desirable behavior than the police, courts, and corrections. So when I grew up in rural Maine, all the families parented everyone else's kids. There were a certain standard of behavior and there were certain things that were not tolerated. And that's very different than living in a community where many people are selling drugs, lots of people are coming and going, people don't really care if you go to school or not, right? So the context in which people are living make a huge influence on whether a person engages in criminal behavior or not. So some other levels of social control. Again, the family unit, according to these researchers, is the most important provider of informal social control. What behavior is appropriate and what behavior is not appropriate. Again, you can't always blame the family if they aren't providing that informal social control. Families vary in their skills and resources to modify behavior, right? So some families have a lot of resources available to them and have lots of interpersonal skills to be able to manage kids that maybe are engaging in difficult behavior or challenging behavior, and other families do not. So families vary in their ability to respond to undesirable or out of control or difficult behavior in a family member. Small informal peer groups, right? We've all heard the term the wrong crowd, right? Also transmit criminal attitudes and behaviors. So if you get in with a bunch of teenagers who are stealing stuff and doing, sketchy things, then that's going to influence an individual's behavior. Then there are like large criminal organizations that actually recruit people, look for people to recruit and socialize them and make things sound wonderful, and then train them how to like sell drugs or that kind of thing, and then employ people in their criminal enterprise. And what's scary about this is if somebody changes their mind, a lot of these criminal organizations require loyalty to the group, absolute loyalty, and then apply their own approaches to social control, like maybe taking your knees out or breaking your fingers or other forms usually related to violence and fear that keep people in the organization even if they don't want to stay in it. So, and again, these kinds of organizations can be sort of loose and informal up to organized crime. So I think we really need to look more at this level of criminal behavior and criminology as opposed to just looking at the individual or just looking at the laws. So what are some of the services within criminal justice that, in terms of social services, that you may or may not know about? And these aren't all of them. These are just sort of the high points in terms of what are the professions and professionals who work in this work. Obviously, lawyers, judges, and those kind of folks. But corrections officers who actually work in prisons and keep things managed within a jail or within a prison system. There may be mobile crisis counselors, often social workers, LCSWs, clinical social workers will respond to a particular situation with the police officer and help to de-escalate it. Probation and parole officers, so people who monitor people who are on probation or on parole in the community, and that can be juvenile probation and parole, or it can be for adults. Mental health counseling happens both in prison sometimes. It's probably not as widely available within jails and prisons as I think it should be or as others think it should be. But there are situations where people get individual counseling and run group counseling. And then there are AA groups that bubble up in particular prisons. But once again, you have to have the privileges to be in general population to be able to attend these meetings. Substance use disorder counseling can also happen both at the individual group and group level. So addiction counseling happens. Family support services. So a liaison between the person who's imprisoned and their family members, and maybe staying in contact with their kids who might be placed in foster care or familial foster care while the person's in prison. So there's a lot of social work kinds of work that happens to support the family while one of their family members is in prison or in jail. Some of those might be parenting classes. It might be, working towards family reunification, working towards regaining child custody, making sure the person has the parenting skills that they need for parenting. A lot of domestic violence and anger management kinds of supports for families can happen in jails and prisons. Again, these services vary one criminal justice system to another, but I think are critical to people addressing whatever issues got them in there in the first place. Employment and education services. Many prisons have a way for people to get their GED or their high school diploma, or in some prisons actually have ways of getting a college degree or working towards a college degree. Many prisons have employment and expect inmates to work, and they do get paid. It's a minimal wage. I don't believe they get paid minimum wage. But once again, they also can, there are jobs or training programs where once someone's released, they'll be able to have skills for a job. So things like welding, baking, you name it, right? So there are programs within prisons to help people develop employment skills so that they can get a good job once they're released. So job training through incarceration and job training once they're released. So again, where the job training happens can vary if it happens at all. But we know that a good job is key to keeping people from engaging in criminal behavior to make money. So it seems to me this is a key service for people who are in jail or in prison. And some places even do job placement, help people find a job once they're released. Certainly one of the barriers to once you're released into the community is housing, particularly if you're a felon. You have to claim that you're a felon. And so this tremendous stigma around having that felon status. So it can be really hard to get housing, even if you have low income status or some HUD, if you qualify for some kind of HUD waiver or HUD monies. A lot of people, and you need first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. And if you don't have a job, how are you going to do that? So lots of people, once they're released, really have nowhere to go in terms of a roof over their head. And you can imagine, without a place to live, that you are probably going to be more likely to come in contact with law enforcement in one way or another. And then there's reentry services, meaning once you're released, there may be certain programs or services to help people with all of the above, for family kinds of supports, individual counseling, employment and education. All of those things can happen either in jail or as reentry services. And unfortunately, far too few of these services exist at all, whether it be while a person's in prison or once they're released. Oftentimes, like I said, somebody's given cab fare and said in some street clothes and see ya, that's it. And I think to a great degree that contributes to recidivism. If people don't have the skills and resources to put a roof over their head and have a decent job, then it almost makes sense that they would return to prison or return to earlier behaviors. So that's a brief overview of the system and the people who work within it.